August 19th, 1945. Northfield, Tinian Island. Lieutenant Jack Dunning stepped to the edge of bomb pit number 2 as heat shimmered off the concrete. The pit was empty, but the weapon intended for it was not hypothetical. A third atomic bomb existed, its plutonium core already en route to Tinian, and Washington planners had identified Tokyo as the preferred target. Dunning held his clipboard against his leg as a B-29 rolled across the taxiway behind him. Ground crews moved through routine checks on fuel lines and electrical connections. Nothing in their pace suggested the atomic campaign had ended. "Transport still inbound," a crew chief reported without looking up. Dunning marked the cradle inspection line on his form. The layout, the tools, the procedures, everything matched the preparations for Fat Man 10 days earlier. The only variable was the missing core, listed on his sheet with a scheduled arrival time from Los Alamos. Across the Pacific, newspapers insisted the United States had built only 2 bombs. Radio commentators said the stockpile was empty. Even officers passing through Tinian repeated the same assumption. There would be no third strike. But the documents in Dunning's hand showed otherwise. The assembly team had instructions ready: internal alignment checks, implosion system verification, detonator routing, electrical continuity tests. Once completed, the unit would move directly from the assembly building to this pit for loading. No new briefing cycle was required. The 25th of July authorization covered all subsequent drops. Dunning stepped back and reviewed the next line: suspension lugs, hoist points, lockouts, standard procedure. He had done it twice before. He expected to do it again today. Rows of B-29s sat in long formation across Northfield, fueled and configured for operational range over Japan. Crews remained on standby. Weather officers produced updated routes. The base's rhythm matched a force preparing for another atomic sortie. Dunning checked his watch. 0741 hours. If the transport appeared soon, assembly could begin within the hour. He looked at the empty cradle, unaware that each action taken on this field was part of an operation that, until moments ago in Tokyo, was still expected to continue. What Lieutenant Dunning did not know was how close this weapon came to being loaded, flown, and dropped on the administrative center of Japan. The news of Hiroshima's destruction reached Tokyo on August 6th, but it produced no immediate shift inside the Supreme War Council. Messages from the city described a new type bomb, yet the military faction insisted the government's negotiating position remain unchanged. Reports from the firebombed districts of earlier months had already conditioned senior officers to catastrophic loss, and they interpreted the atomic blast as another extension of the ongoing air campaign the deadlock held. On August 7th, American analysts reviewed intercepted communications and noted no signs of Japanese capitulation. Truman's advisors concluded that a single bomb, however destructive, was not enough to force surrender. The military's planning rhythm continued, and the July 25th directive authorizing ongoing atomic strikes remained active. No additional order was required. Then, on August 8th, the Soviet Union entered the war. Their offensive into Manchuria began with immediate breakthroughs. Dismantling Japanese defensive positions within hours, intelligence summaries arriving in Washington that evening described rapid Soviet gains and the collapse of multiple Japanese formations. The effect on Japan's leadership was severe, but not decisive. Arguments inside the Supreme Council only intensified. No unified instruction emerged. On August 9th, the United States carried out the second atomic strike, this time against Nagasaki. The B-29 delivered the weapon at 11:02 a.m. local time. Initial assessments from the city indicated extensive damage and heavy casualties. Yet within Japan's highest political circles, the same impasse persisted. No agreement on surrender terms could be reached. The peace faction and the military faction remained locked in opposing positions. Outside Japan, a different narrative emerged. Public announcements and press reports across the United States stated confidently that the atomic stockpile was exhausted. Commentators described Hiroshima and Nagasaki as the entirety of America's nuclear arsenal. Even within sections of the armed forces, officers repeated the assumption that no additional bombs were available. At Los Alamos, however, scientists understood the perception was false. The third plutonium core was already complete, and more were scheduled to follow. Inside Washington, target discussions continued in parallel. Tokyo rose rapidly to the top of the list due to its remaining government infrastructure and symbolic weight. A strike against the capital, planners argued, could break the political stalemate in a single blow. The option remained open, and the machinery required for execution was already in motion. By the end of August 9th, 2 cities had been destroyed. The Soviets had entered the war, and Tokyo still refused to yield. The stage was set for the next step, the completion and deployment of the third bomb. In the hours after the Nagasaki strike, the Manhattan Project's production schedule continued without interruption. Los Alamos technicians finalized machining on the next plutonium core, following the same implosion specifications used for Fat Man. The sequence had been rehearsed for months. Nothing about the workflow suggested the atomic campaign had reached its end. On August 10th, logistics officers confirmed the timetable. The third core would be ready by August 19th. Additional units were expected every 3 to 4 days after that. These dates appeared in internal memos, planning documents, and freight schedules routed through Kirtland Field. No alternative instructions accompanied them. The industrial system moved forward on momentum alone. At Hanford, reactor output remained steady. Production teams monitored separation batches and documented yields, aware that the extracted plutonium would be shaped into future cores. The continuation of work at each site revealed the depth of the program's inertia. An entire network of facilities was synchronized to produce nuclear weapons at defined intervals. Planners understood that once a core was finished, it could proceed directly into assembly and deployment without additional presidential approval. Back on Tinian, the assembly crews reviewed procedures for integrating the arriving core into a completed Fat Man casing. Electrical technicians prepared to test firing circuitry, armorers inspected detonator housings. Only one sensory detail marked the environment: the constant low hum of generators along the assembly building's exterior wall, a reminder that power to the instrumentation could not fail during internal checks. Strategists in Washington discussed potential targets as these technical preparations advanced. Tokyo's prominence grew with each meeting. It remained the administrative center of the Japanese government and still retained infrastructure untouched by earlier firebombing. Operational planners concluded that a strike on the capital could force a political collapse where the previous 2 attacks had not. Meanwhile, the 509th Composite Group maintained readiness levels suited to immediate execution. B-29 crews were kept on standby, their aircraft configured for long-range atomic delivery. Weather officers submitted daily analyses for routes into Japan. Commanders received no indications that the tempo would slow. By mid-August, the third corps' transport schedule was set. Once shipped, it would move through Kirtland, then across the Pacific. Before reaching Tinian for final assembly, every element of the chain was aligned. As August 19th approached, the operational picture sharpened. The core was nearly complete. The target under discussion was Tokyo, and Japan's leadership remained divided. The final decision would depend not on American capability, but on whether Japan surrendered before the bomb arrived. Inside Tokyo, the effects of Hiroshima and Nagasaki reached the Supreme War Council in fragmented reports. On August 9th, as the third bomb's production moved forward abroad, the Japanese leadership remained unable to reach a unified position. The peace faction argued that the combination of atomic attacks and the Soviet offensive demanded immediate acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration. The military faction rejected this, insisting that negotiations must preserve Japan's sovereignty and avoid occupation. Their positions were incompatible, and no agreement emerged. The Soviet advance into Manchuria deepened the crisis. Field reports described rapid collapses of defensive lines and the loss of key strongpoints. These messages reached senior officers in Tokyo, yet the reactions only reinforced existing divisions. Some argued the Soviet entry made continued resistance impossible. Others claimed the situation required even firmer resolve, believing the homeland could still impose enough casualties to gain better terms. On August 10th, Emperor Hirohito intervened for the first time. He directed his ministers to accept the Allied terms with the sole condition that the imperial institution be preserved. His statement carried weight, but not enough to break the deadlock. Army leaders insisted that occupation and war crimes provisions remained unacceptable. Debate continued into the night without resolution. In Washington, intercepted communications showed no sign of unified surrender. Analysts concluded the impasse was holding. U.S. planners recognized that Japan's paralysis might require a third atomic strike, potentially on Tokyo, to force an outcome that negotiations could not. Meanwhile, operational tempo abroad remained unchanged. At Tinian, the Third Corps' expected arrival kept crews on standby. Pilots and navigators attended briefing reviews. The only sensory detail within this section came from inside the Japanese cabinet building, the dull thud of distant anti-aircraft drills echoing through the walls, a reminder that the city still prepared for conventional raids even as atomic destruction loomed. On August 12th and 13th, the Japanese government remained gridlocked. Attempts to draft a mutual statement failed. Civilian ministers warned that further delay risked national collapse. Military leaders countered that surrender without assurances would dishonor the state. Both sides believed their position represented the country's only viable path. Then, on the night of August 14th, officers opposed to surrender attempted a coup. They seized parts of the Imperial Palace grounds and sought to prevent Hirohito's recorded message from being broadcast. The attempt failed by dawn, and authority returned to the emperor. With the coup suppressed, Hirohito delivered a second, more forceful directive. Japan would accept the Allied terms. But the decision came only hours before the Third Corps was expected to reach Tinian, leaving almost no margin between surrender and the next atomic strike. Hirohito's decision on August 14th moved through Japan's chain of command in urgent messages. Civilian ministers relayed the emperor's order to accept the Allied terms, while military leaders issued instructions to halt actions that might jeopardize the transition. For several hours, confusion persisted across Tokyo as units awaited final confirmation. But by midnight, the intention to surrender was clear. Across the Pacific, the operational machinery continued uninterrupted. Transport aircraft carrying the third plutonium core had already crossed the midpoint of its route. Its arrival had been scheduled before news of the coup attempt or the emperor's intervention. The sequence of packing, transfer, and transit had begun days earlier, insulated from political developments. Nothing in the logistics timetable reflected a change. At Tinian, crews remained on standby through the night. The assembly building stayed lit as technicians reviewed firing circuits, detonator housings, and implosion instrumentation for the incoming unit. Only one sensory detail broke the monotony: the steady rattle of tool trays being wheeled across the concrete floor as armorers prepared workspace for casing integration. They were following procedure, because procedure had never been revised. On the morning of August 15th, Japan's surrender announcement was broadcast. The Emperor's recorded message played across the country shortly after noon. In Washington, the news reached the War Department and the Joint Chiefs within minutes. The reaction was immediate. Operations associated with further atomic deployment were suspended. Command authority shifted from preparation to cessation. But the physical reality of the third bomb remained. The core arrived on Tinian and was offloaded according to standard protocol. It moved into secure storage rather than into the assembly line. Its status changed from operational to inactive, but not because of any technical limitation. U.S. leadership understood that surrender, not the lack of weapons, had prevented additional atomic strikes, including bombs 3, 4, 5, and 6. In the weeks that followed, the unused core was selected for the 1946 Bikini Atoll test series. It would become the fourth nuclear device ever detonated. The decision reflected a shift in purpose, from immediate wartime use to post-war experimentation and strategic planning. The infrastructure built for repeated attacks on Japan now supported a larger, longer-term direction. Yet the speed of these transitions revealed how close the third bomb had come to deployment. The margin between active operations and halted missions was measured not in weeks or days, but in hours. And as the core moved into storage, the United States began redirecting the entire atomic system toward a different objective, one that would define the early Cold War. With Japan's surrender confirmed, the urgent pace of wartime operations slowed, but the Manhattan Project's machinery did not. The reactors at Hanford continued producing plutonium. According to existing schedules, Los Alamos received updated directives that shifted assembly work from combat readiness to post-war testing. The transition happened quietly. Nothing in the physical structure of the system changed. Only the destination of its output did. During late 1945, the third core, now removed from operational status, was assigned to the forthcoming Bikini Atoll tests. Planning documents classified it as part of the initial sequence of nuclear detonations intended to study blast effects on naval vessels. The decision underscored a new strategic purpose. Wartime use had ended, but the research and development cycle remained fully active. As the months progressed, stockpile accumulation began. Completed components moved into secure storage. Production lines that had once been calibrated for immediate deployment shifted seamlessly toward long-term readiness. Scientists refined core geometries. Engineers experimented with more efficient detonation systems. The only sensory detail within this period came from the control rooms at Hanford. Steady instrument clicks, marking neutron counts, as technicians monitored each batch of processed material. Inside the War Department, analytical branches reviewed the pace of production and projected future outputs. Reports concluded that, had Japan not surrendered when it did, American forces would have possessed the capability to carry out repeated atomic strikes through the autumn of 1945 and into early 1946. Historians later determined that the United States already had the infrastructure for an indefinite atomic campaign, and that only the Emperor's August 15th acceptance prevented bombs 3 through 6 from being used. Meanwhile, the initial planning for the Bikini tests drew on lessons from Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Analysts examined blast radii, shockwave profiles, and material yield to shape the scenarios. The unused third core, once intended for Tokyo, now served as an instrument for measuring the destructive capacity of an entirely new category of weapon. Its role shifted from operational threat to technical benchmark, but its significance remained. By early 1946, the United States possessed not only a functioning nuclear arsenal, but a system